The glory of Rome, once the empire of empires, ruled by a Caesar, declared in his day to be Lord and Savior of the world. But in 58 AD, a letter written by a Roman citizen, addressed to residents of Rome and circulated throughout the empire, challenged the power and glory of Rome. This is the land of the Bible, Italy. The country of Italy, with its capital Rome, is another part of the land of the Bible. The Roman Empire ruled at the coming of Jesus Christ and during the time of the writings of the New Testament. Mark DeHaan and Jimmy DeYoung have returned to the Middle East to reflect on one of those New Testament writings, a letter written by the Apostle Paul, a letter to the church in Rome. A letter that, in an indirect but powerful way, challenged Caesar and exposed the weakness of the empire.
Welcome to the city of Rome, Main Street, Rome.
Just like the pictures, just like the Travel Channel, Jim.
Well, except I think we'd better clarify things for everybody. This is not actually Rome, it's Bethshan. It's a city, a Roman city in the times of Christ that was a replica of the city of Rome.
And in the glory days of Rome, in her heyday, she actually built 4,000 little Romes just like this all across the empire.
This city now is called Bethshan, but in the days of Jesus Christ, it was called how do you say it? Scythopolis?
Always depending on you to say it.
Scythopolis. I think we'll refer to it from now on as Bethshan. But it was indeed a replica of the Roman city that was the capital for the Roman Empire. It has all the attributes of one of those great cities like the city of Rome. Like the other many Romes, it had its main street, or Cardo, lined with its shops, its bathhouses, complete with a steam room and an exercise room, an amphitheater to entertain the soldiers and the crowds with gladiatorial games, a theater for performances, even public restrooms with running water, and of course, temples built to honor their many gods.
In the first century, the glory of Rome was seen throughout the empire. It was seen in cities like Ephesus, Pergamon, and Hierapolis, all in what is now Turkey, in Alexandria in Egypt, and in Jericho in Jordan.
There was not one Rome, there were many Romes. You can see the results to the present day yet. When a Roman colonist would found an important new town, maybe at the juncture of a river or something like that, they would want all the conveniences and comforts that they had back in the imperial capital. There they would also have to have a Senate house. There they would also have to have a hippodrome. They would have to have a theater, the baths, and so on. You can see some of the remains of these to the present day yet.
If you just consider the extent of it, the Romans were able to conquer practically every inch of land from Scotland all the way to the Middle East. Every inch of land overlooking the Mediterranean Sea was Roman. They referred to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea. And imagine just being able to connect all those different people, to integrate, to assimilate all those different people with their customs, their beliefs, their traditions. Just that in itself is extraordinary.
The Roman Empire at this time was probably the most successful single phenomenon in the history of the world up to that time. It was the greatest empire. It was the most powerful nation at that time. It had inherited so much of Greek and Mesopotamian culture. It had added to that culture, and so it was a powerhouse in just about every avenue you can think of.
And this idea of sharing a common culture that stretched, in fact, from Scotland to the Middle East, and a culture that fed itself on the various customs and traditions of these other people. So this capacity to assimilate as well as imposing their own culture.
As great as Rome was, it was weakened by a fundamental flaw, a weakness that would eventually result in the fall of the empire.
And one of the ways we know about that weakness is that in the first century, an important letter was written describing it. In fact, Jim picked up a replica of a first century Roman letter, we think, bound in leather. Inside you've got paper written on in Greek, which would have been the language of...
Very interesting. You know, in that first century, Rome was at the height of its power. And as Mart said, a letter was written. The writer of the letter, the Apostle Paul, he sent this letter to Rome.
The letter to the Romans is one of the few letters Paul wrote to a church he had not planted and never even visited before.
Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God. To all who are in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints. Romans chapter 1.
St. Paul is probably in Corinth at the time, and he is writing the people in Rome in this epistle or letter to the church in Rome. He wants to get there. He hasn't been there yet. In fact, he says, I'd like to come to Rome, and then I'd like to go on to Spain if possible.
What has hindered him? Well, he never explains that, but probably it's the needs of the ministry where he's already been, and preaching the gospel in the Eastern Mediterranean area, and not only in planting churches in significant places, but helping a church like the church in Corinth with some of its problems that it had after he founded the church. All of this has occupied his time. But finally now, as Paul writes to the Romans, he anticipates that after a brief stop in Jerusalem, he's going to be able finally to come to Rome and to visit the people there.
Without ceasing, I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request, if by some means, now at last I may find a way in the will of God to come to you, for I long to see you. Romans chapter 1.
As a Roman citizen and Christian, Paul clearly understood the challenge to the followers of Jesus posed by both the culture and the authority of the Roman Empire.
And what's so important about this letter is that it reveals that Rome had a weakness, like a fault line within the empire, within the culture. It was far more significant than the problem of any invading army. Oh, how the great have fallen, Jim. Look at the size of this thing.
Dramatic scene here.
Can you imagine what the earth must have been doing to bring these down? Look at it, must have fallen from up here, hits the wall, breaks in half.
Across the Cardo or the street here.
Look at the way it crushed the pavement there. And this is the Capitol here. This must have been on top. Look at it, where it ended up.
Beth-Shan, or Scythopolis, as it was known during the Roman era, was built on a fault line where the Jezreel Valley and the Jordan Valley intersected. The Jordan Valley, a part of that great Rift Valley, which extends in the north from Turkey all the way to the south into Kenya, Africa. In one night, in 749 AD, this city was destroyed by a great earthquake.
But something even more profound than that was happening throughout the whole empire. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, describes characteristics of the culture, characteristics of the world of his day, that show us that the glory of Rome was actually masking a spiritual fault line, a spiritual weakness within the human race itself.
St. Paul, in the letter to the Romans, is very clear on pointing out the contrast between Christianity, belief in one God, the Creator God, against the paganisms at the time in the city, where they were worshiping the creatures and God's handiwork instead of God himself.
They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator. Romans chapter 1.
Paul says on the one hand, in chapter 1, that nature is something that reveals something to us about God. That if we look at nature as we should, it teaches us that there is a God, that he's powerful. That's the only way we can explain the world of nature when we really begin to investigate it.
Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Romans chapter 1.
And Paul, again, always makes a distinction between the high theology of Christianity and the low moral level in Rome and what the pagans produced by way of religion and ethics, which was not very lofty.
One of the foundational weaknesses of Rome can be seen right here at this spot. This plaza was dominated by a temple which would have stood here in the upper level. The temple had 4 columns, 30 feet high.
So throughout the Roman Empire, there were temples to false gods, temples just like those in Rome. Dr. Corrado Primavera, born in Rome, is familiar with one of the oldest temples in the city.
We are at the Pantheon, the most well-preserved Roman temple since the 1st century AD. And he was built by Agrippa, a good friend of the Octavianus Augustus, the first emperor in Rome. Agrippa built this temple in 27 BC, before Christ, and he dedicated this temple to all gods. That's the name Pantheon, from the Greek word all gods. And the idea was to came out with a plan to celebrate all gods so that the Romans can find their ways to gain favor from any kind of gods. This gives us a taste of the Roman religion in that time. Pluralistic, polytheistic view. So the Roman religion celebrating all kind of gods, all kind of cults, to find ways to receive favor from any kind of god.
The kind of gods that the Greeks and the Romans worshipped is quite clear from, I think, Paul's address in Mars Hill, Acts 17, when he points out that while he's waiting for the others to come and join him in the city of Athens, he looks around and he's very depressed by all the statues of the gods and goddesses, and even one to the unknown god, as you recall, to make sure all their bets were covered. This is so typical. All the Romans did when the Greeks freighted their Olympian crew to them is simply change their names when they went through Italian immigration. Hello Zeus, now you're Jupiter. Hello Hera, now you're Juno. And so the Roman religious system was only based on basically the Greek mythology, the various gods and goddesses in Mount Olympus that so many people know about.
When Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, even the emperor himself was regarded as a god.
The cult of the Caesars began pretty innocently. Under Augustus, nobody took it too seriously. It was a case of a pledge of allegiance to the Roman central regime. But later, when you get emperors worse than Augustus, who did get fat-headed, who were impressed with their own divine capabilities, people like Caligula later on, or Domitian at the end of the 1st century, then they took their own importance and their deity during their lifetime more seriously. Usually deity came to a Roman emperor only after his death, but now they started jumping the gun and having the deity accorded them even during their lifetime. And that becomes more serious then.
They changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. Romans chapter 1.
But why in Paul's letter to the Romans would he express such concern about the kind of worship and spirituality that he had seen across the empire? Why would such pluralism, why would such worship of Greco-Roman gods be so dangerous?
The danger, according to Paul, is that our Creator cares enough to be angry when he sees those he loves being ruined by gods that are not gods, and by worship that is worthless.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Romans chapter 1.
And this alarmingly bad news helps to explain Paul's reason for sending his letter to the Christian residents of Rome. In behalf of a Lord greater than Caesar, Paul wants his readers to know that when people ignore the gift of conscience and when we deny the evidence in the creation of one who is infinitely greater and wiser than ourselves, we place ourselves in opposition to the God who created us and loves us, and choose instead the way of death. But Paul is just beginning. In a way that's too important for us to miss, he writes his letter to make a declaration of good news, which in its day was a not-so-subtle challenge to the Caesar.
As much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Romans chapter 1.